folks, I know there's a history here. I'd like to get this hearing in today. You know, everybody needs to just focus on the relevant facts, okay? I know there's a history here.
Are you talking up by Sunset Mart? Up the hill by the gas station?
Yeah.
Okay. Why did you? All right. Who's responsible here?
What's that?
Who's responsible here? Whose house is this?
You haven't been drinking or anything, right?
No.
Okay. Drive careful, okay?
Thank you.
This is what the other group had that ran away.
Oh, really?
They just ditched it.
Awesome.
Yeah, those ones kept walking in the car. And the other one.
It's truly for the win.
That I was given to. So there was 2 different discs. Okay? They all knew about it.
We're not here to talk about the alcohol stuff, okay?
Okay, yeah.
But this is the second noise complaint we've had here tonight within 2 hours.
How are you?
Good, how are you?
Good. Is this your place?
Yeah.
Perfect. You know why we're here?
I see noise.
Noise, yeah.
Yeah.
Big speaker right there.
Yeah.
Nothing against having a party. Once neighbors start calling in, then we have an issue.
Like brains, and like if you need a lot of brains, you're gonna be in trouble.
It's November 29th. 4 people that were murdered, and you want to fuck around. You got 8 families that are being affected by this, and
connection to Mr. Kohberger.
correct.
Any response?
Your Honor, we didn't realize this was going to be an issue today. We have given
I
the
didn't either.
defense everything that we received from the lab. They've asked for DNA workups on other people. To the extent that they don't have them, they weren't done. We can't produce something that doesn't exist. We've provided everything. There's one outstanding lab report that relates to the forensic examination by the lab personnel of the crime scene itself. We received the bid. That's the only outstanding lab report. Everything else, along with all the notes, is what there is, and it's been provided to the defense. And if they're hoping that there's something else there, it's not there.
Ms. Taylor?
Well,
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Your Honor, it's part of our third motion to compel. It's still something that we don't have. We also don't have the unexpected corrective actions, unexpected results from the Idaho State Police Forensics Lab for the 6 months before and the 6 months after November 13th, 2022. We did get some, but it's a narrow scope, and we asked for the full year, 6 months before and 6 months after. That's also in our motion.
Sure. I understand your responsibility is to turn over every rock, but you can't get things that don't exist as well. So, I mean, there has to be some level of trust in discovery. You're all sworn attorneys. And so Mr. Thompson is saying that there's one more lab report that is coming your way today, I heard you say.
Maybe not today. We were waiting to receive it so that we can process it for discovery. It's supposed to be in any time.
Okay, I misunderstood that. So it's coming soon. It has to come soon because we're 6 weeks away from the trial. So we're going to be very rushed about a lot of things, but I'm going to talk about that a little more later too. So what about the other claim, Mr. Thompson? Do you want to address that? The other mistakes?
Corrective action log, unexpected result log. We have that in part, but not the full.
I don't know what exists that we haven't received. We provided all the requests to the lab, and they've assured us that they have provided us with everything they have within the scope of those requests. I'm not sure what else to say. I mean, we can make a supplemental inquiry to clarify that after we finish in court today. But I'm kind of sitting here saying, Judge was giving me everything we know to exist.
Well, that would be wise to check on that.
We will.
Because we don't want this to come back on the eve of trial.
Yes, sir.
Or, 4 years from now at an appeal.
Yes, sir.
So we want to make sure that we have combed through all the information that has any bearing or argument of bearing on this case. That's how
Ms. James is making a note right now. We'll send the inquiry out later today.
Okay.
Thanks, sir.
Your Honor, just for a point of clarification, we also ask for all emails, text messages, electronic messages, or other messages. Some have been provided, but we don't have assurance that that's all. And so for the same reason, we want to make sure that we have the complete file.
Okay, Mr. Thompson.
We have told them, we have given them everything that we know to exist. We've asked the lab provided it to us, we sent it to them. At this point, all I'm hearing is speculation, is they think maybe or they wish something else was there. But as far as we know, it doesn't exist. I don't know what else we can say. You can't respond to something that isn't real. Sorry, Judge.
I mean, we're just sorting it out.
Yes, sir.
Making sure that everything that there is shared.
We'll
Except for the ones that you don't want to.
Absolutely.
share.
Yes, sir.
And that's one of the reasons for it.
We'll make an additional inquiry to the lab to see if there's anything else in the form of emails that they haven't already provided to us.
I would add, I mean, there are times, okay, in the world of the law, that sometimes people forget to do things, or sometimes things fall through the cracks. And so it's always healthy to make sure that it is done thoroughly.
Absolutely. Thank you, Judge.
Thank you.
You're now ready to call Steve Mercer.
Okay. Just one moment. Are your experts in the courtroom right now?
Yeah.
Do they need to be in the courtroom?
Your Honor, I ask that they be allowed to remain in the courtroom, seated where they are, so they're just kind of alone.
Right. Any objection to that? I don't know who is going to here.
Sure, we'd also have the witnesses excluded.
I'm going to exclude your witnesses, so they're not hearing what the other witnesses are testifying by, and that'll be, I think, a cleaner, more accurate response. So then I don't want to have them reacting to the other testimony. We'll hear each testimony, or each witness's testimony be independent. Okay, so if you please have your other experts excluded from the courtroom.
Where would the court like them to go? This is a media intensive environment, and I don't want them to be bothered by the media walk away from
The law library.
the May I escort them there?
Sure. Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Mercer.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Taylor. Okay, Ms. Mercer, come on up. Please raise your right hand. Hey, yeah, it's,
Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you give in this case shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth under penalty of perjury?
I do. Thank you, Ms. Mercer. Go ahead, get some water there. I'll take care of that. And once you're seated, could you please state your name and spell your last?
Yes, my name is Stephen with a PH Mercer, Merceder.
All right, thank you, sir. Okay, Ms. Taylor?
Good morning, Mr. Mercer.
Good morning,
What city and state are you from?
Rockville, Maryland.
What do you do for work?
I am a licensed attorney in Maryland and the District of Columbia in the field of criminal defense with the area of specialization in DNA and forensic litigation.
How long have you been an attorney?
I was licensed in the state of Maryland in 1995 and in the District of Columbia in 1997. I'm also a member of several federal bars, including the Supreme Court, where I appeared as co-counsel in Maryland v. King, a DNA database case from 2013, as well as the Fourth Circuit, the DC Circuit, and a number of federal district courts.
I want to back up a little bit and have you tell me about your educational background.
So I have a undergraduate degree, bachelor's degree in English from Syracuse University, 1984. Juris Doctor JD from the District of Columbia School of Law from 1994.
And you mentioned you have a specialty in DNA. Where does that come from?
So my experience with DNA began with the first constitutional challenge to Maryland's DNA database statute, and that started in 2002 in the case of State v. Raines, where it raised a Fourth Amendment challenge to the compelled collection of DNA from convicted offenders. Prevailed on that case in the trial court. It was appealed to the Court of Appeals, which is now called the Maryland Supreme Court. The Maryland Supreme Court, in a sharply divided 4-3 decision, reversed, sent it back for trial, tried the case, and that was really the beginning of my experience with forensic DNA litigation. And then from that point, I continued in that field, attended training with the District of Columbia Public Defender Service. I began to collaborate with the Innocence Project and the Forensics Division at the Maryland Office of the Public Defender, doing indigent defense work and innocence work, and began to work closely with DNA scientists who actually did the wet chemistry work, had numerous opportunities to tour law enforcement labs, including the NIST lab, as well as Montgomery County's lab, Bodie Technology, the FBI lab, as well. And so I continued working in the field, providing both direct representation in DNA cases as well as consultation through my private practice. And then in 2010, the public defender recruited me to head up the forensics division at Maryland's Office of the Public Defender, which is a statewide public defender system. And then there, I really dived much deeper into the field of DNA forensic litigation at that time. And if there's some questions, I can explain that further.
I may ask you some others about that in just a moment. Would you tell me about any publications, any articles?
Yes, so I published an article, co-authored an article in Maryland's DNA Databank back in the early 2000s following the State v. Raines decision. I also published an article in the NYU's Law Review about shadow DNA databanks with a co-author, Jessica Grable, and those are the principal articles with respect to forensic DNA.
And I think you mentioned a couple of professional organizations that you belong to. Are there others?
Yes, so I'm a member of the jurisprudential section of the American Academy of Forensic Scientists, and I've given presentations there. For example, in 2018, I gave a presentation on proposed regulation of the field of forensic genealogy. And then I'm also a member of the National Criminal Defense Attorneys Association and a number of local bar associations in Maryland, as well as the State Bar Association.
You mentioned forensic genetic genealogy just now. Can you tell me your background related to that?
So following really the advent of forensic genealogy in 2018, that is when I had the opportunity to litigate cases, criminal cases involving that technique, the testing and the investigation related to the testing, and to receive discovery of the testing, and the interpretation of the test results that were obtained through searching of genetic databanks.
You are here on Bryan Kohberger's. How did you become involved in this?
Yeah, so the question was, what would a reasonable defense attorney do when confronted with DNA evidence that needs to be litigated? What are the minimum practice standards? So I'm not here to discuss Idaho's discovery rules or offer legal opinions about constitutional standards. Rather, my area of focus is based on my experience, training, and expertise in forensic DNA litigation, and what a minimum practice standard would be for a reasonably competent trial attorney who must comply with their duty to investigate a case on behalf of their client.
And is that because of what you get when you get genetic genealogy materials?
Well, yes. I mean, forensic evidence is often central in the case, and DNA evidence in particular. And so when there's an item, for example, here of an environmental sample of trace DNA evidence that, as I understand it from reviewing the pleadings, was twice tested, first for an STR profile, and then later for a genomic profile. The question becomes, what is the minimum practice standard for an attorney to be effective in their representation of a client given that type of evidence?
When you're talking about two samples happening, or two tests happening, why should an attorney know about that?
Well, there are a number of reasons why it's crucial for the attorney to investigate any testing of evidence that is central to a case. And again, here it's an environmental sample of trace DNA that is being tested. And so it's essential for the attorney to know, for a number of reasons, about the details of the testing and the investigation when we're talking specifically about forensic genealogy. Number one is there's pretrial concerns. And those pretrial concerns that can be raised would involve suppression issues and potentially Fourth Amendment issues. These are questions that are very much evolving in the state of our litigation. But to understand the viability of a Fourth Amendment challenge, there has to be a factual investigation. There has to be a determination of the conduct that law enforcement undertook during the forensic analysis of the genealogy. So, for example, was it fast and loose? Was there searching of databanks that violated the terms and conditions of those databanks? Was there surreptitious DNA collection from individuals, targeted individuals in family trees? So these are these are very fact-specific inquiries that the attorney must know in formulating a suppression challenge under the Fourth Amendment, because it's all about reasonable expectations of privacy. And what's really critical here to understand, and this is close to me from my litigation, early on, the government and law enforcement's argument was always there are minimal privacy interests at stake because forensic DNA profile is like a fingerprint, and it says nothing about who the person is. But now with forensic genealogy, we're talking about genomic profiles, potentially whole genomic profiles, or at the very least a SNP profile, single nucleotide polymorphism profile. Single nucleotide polymorphism. An SNP profile that contains a vast amount of information that is very, very private. And so this is a real game changer in the privacy interests that are at stake, and that the attorney needs to understand in investigating the case to assess and to evaluate that suppression issue, that Fourth Amendment issue. So that's one issue pre-trial. There's also concerns about reliability. And by reliability, I'm not talking necessarily about the forensic genomic profile, but I'm talking about the STR profile. And again, because as I understand it from the pleadings, there were multiple tests on the same evidence, environmental sample trace DNA. One produced a STR profile that I understand from the pleadings is represented as being a single source male profile. The reliability of that needs to be investigated, and certainly through one aspect of that is investigating the laboratory documentation that is provided for the STR testing. But we also have to appreciate, and again, I'm not a DNA scientist or a biologist, but I'm an attorney that works with experts, and I need to know what type of expert to hire. And one thing that I do realize in looking at this is when there's multiple tests of the same piece of evidence, and you have a genomic profile, in other words, potentially the entire human genome that is typed from this environmental sample trace DNA, or at least an SNP profile, which is somewhere in the neighborhood of 700,000 locations of data. What does that tell us about the STR profile markers? So for example, the STR profile markers, which are typed, are 20 out of 30,000 STR markers overall. And so what I would be investigating with a qualified expert is, one, I don't know from the pleadings if there's a whole genome profile that's been developed for the forensic genealogy, but if there is, that should contain STR markers. What does that tell us about the reliability of the STR testing? Is there any potential for artifacts? Is there any potential for an undetected low-level mixture? Those types of questions that are potentially available to inquire and ask about, where you have multiple tests with the same piece of evidence, and it's an environmental sample of trace DNA. Now, if it's just an SNP profile, I say just, but that's 700,000 locations of information that is like a probabilistic future diary of someone's health, medical, and all manner of conditions that are linked to genetics. That may not have the STR markers in it itself, but it will have information, SNP markers in the neighborhood of, so to speak, of STR markers that will also shed light potentially on those STR markers and the reliability of those STR markers. So these are, particularly in a capital case, crucial areas of inquiry that must be undertaken by the defense team in conjunction with experts that they retain. But they can't even decide what experts to retain without having the discovery. And that's the minimum practice standard. And that's a point that I've made in testimony before courts where I've been accepted as an expert in Maryland, DC, and Virginia. that the minimum practice standard is that the attorney must obtain discovery of the scientific testing of an evidence sample. And that, particularly so in the capital case, and particularly where we're talking about an environmental sample of trace DNA, it's absolutely crucial to get that discovery, because then that informs the scope of the investigation, the experts to hire, and what have you. Now, also with respect to forensic genealogy, it's important not to separate this out into all these different components. It is, you have the S&P testing, and then you also have the development of these family trees through database searching. This is all part of the same testing and experiment. They go really hand in hand, and you can't unravel them. They really have to be considered together as a single cord of different strands of the testing and experiment, because the attorney needs to know how these family trees have been developed, because we're talking now about trial issues, and the government is introducing the STR profile. They have to introduce statistics that explain the significance of any STR match that the government is identifying as central to its case. And so the defense must investigate ways to cross-examine those statistics and the rarity of that match that the government is attaching great significance to. And so an area to look into and to inquire about are the limits of the statistical tool that the government is using, or the state is using, which is based on the premise that sort of what's called the random person not excluded. And that's answering the question of the rarity of a profile in a population of unrelated people. But the key point there is unrelated. So we know there's no universe where a STR profile has no relatives. And in fact, in a case involving forensic genealogy, the way that the defendant is identified is by searching a pool of related people. And so we need to be able to investigate and evaluate the rarity of a profile within a related population. And that's a different question than what the government answers with its random person not excluded statistic that is typically used. And so, again, without the discovery of the forensic genealogy, both the testing as well as the experiments that are done with the test results, i.e. the database searches, as well as the family tree build-out, the attorney can't investigate that. And in that situation, by not investigating it, is not complying with their duty to investigate that is required, especially in the capital case.
I've heard you say that when you have a sample, in this case, a DNA sample from a tree from a knife, that was STR testing done, and then when you go, when you have genetic genealogy testing, you end up with whole genome testing or an SNP profile. Did I understand that?
Yes, and it's unclear to me at this point what type of genomic profile was developed, whether it was a whole genome sequence or whether it was an SNP profile, which contains about 700,000 locations of very personal, private information.
I think I heard you say that no matter which one of those were done for genetic genealogy, that you need to look at those to test the reliability of the STR profile. Did I hear that right?
Yes, so this is, as an attorney, and not a scientist, but as an attorney who has a duty to investigate, this now is an area where the attorney will look to retain a qualified expert who can evaluate and assess the linkages between the SNP profile or whole genomic profile and an STR profile. To be sure, an SNP profile or forensic genomic profile can't be searched in CODIS. It's not that type of situation. They can't be directly compared. But there are techniques that can evaluate if it is a whole genomic profile. You would look to a scientist who then would be targeting the areas of the whole genomic profile that comprise the STR profile, to then evaluate the reliability of the STR profile, the potential for any mixture, the potential for any artifacts in the STR profile. Or if it's an SNP profile which doesn't have the STR locations in it, then you would look for an expert who understands that the neighboring regions around where the STR markers can be evaluated and assessed to provide information about what the STR markers could be.
Can I clarify something? Sure. So what you're saying is that you need to look at the qualified scientists will have to look at the SNP profile to compare it to the STP profile for the reliability of the STP profile.
The STR profile.
STR.
Yes, so there could be clues, absolutely, that could be discerned from an analysis of the SNP or whole genomic profile. Because again, we're talking about two different tests of the same piece of evidence. And there have been, in peer-reviewed publication, I mean, one that comes to mind is Jae-Wah Kim, who published in the journal Cell about how an SNP profile can be linked to an STR profile. And that's by zeroing in on sort of the neighboring regions and examining those. So again, I'm not a biologist or scientist, but I'm an attorney, who has a duty to investigate, and to investigate requires hiring experts to examine this data, this discovery that hasn't been produced yet. And so that's why the minimum practice standard is to give that discovery, so that the attorney can then assess that discovery and then retain a qualified scientist to help understand the extent to which the SNP testing will shed light on the reliability of the STR testing that has already been done in the same discovery.
Okay, so that having that profile on the SNP can verify the legitimacy of the STR.
Right, so that's my hypothesis. That's what I go to the expert to inquire about. Because again, this is a very much an emerging area of forensic science and litigation.
Sure.
And
Evolving.
yes,
I'm going to object again. I don't believe that this witness is qualified to opine on what's needed in these scientific processes. He just indicated that it was his personal hypothesis. I would renew my objection on it.
Well, I'm going to overrule that because I asked the questions.
Sorry. I asked the question.
When I'm talking about either the whole genome or the SNP profile, am I looking for just like a sheet of paper that has a bunch of numbers on it, or is there a packet of information that I need to go to my expert?
no, you need the raw data of the profile along with, it's similar to the sort of data that you obtain for the SDR testing. You get the raw data of the profile, you get the laboratory protocols, you get all the bench notes, how the profile was generated, but also you should get the discovery about how the profile was then searched in different databases and family trees constructed.
That was going to be my next question. I heard you say that we can't look at this whole genome sequencing or the SNP in one category and then look at the building the tree to identify from the genetic genealogy piece, the genealogist piece, in its own separate areas. That they're not two separate lanes that they combine.
Yes, they go hand in hand. You do one or the other. I mean, they go together.
Why?
I'm sorry?
Can you tell me why? Can you explain why you say they go together, why you don't?
Well, the SMP profile is what is searched in the ancestry database to then identify, potential relatives. And then family trees are built out. That's the object of the SMP testing. What's important to know from a defense perspective in terms of trial work and potential areas of cross-examination, the government is going to be introducing a statistic that is premised on the assumption of an unrelated universe of people. So what's the chance of finding a profile in a population where there's no relatedness between that profile and anyone in that universe? And so, as you know from talking about this whole concept of forensic genealogy, people who are related have similar DNA. And so the statistics change when you are talking about the chance of finding a profile within a related pool, a related universe of individuals. And that's a legitimate area of inquiry on cross-examination for the defense to demonstrate the limitations of the statistical questions that the state is presenting to its expert witness. And to do that, you need to know, for example, who the population of related people are, because often from my work on the forensic genealogy, what I've seen is that when a match is found, when the STR match is found, then all building out, all further testing stops on the forensic genealogy side. And so it's important to know who hasn't been tested on the related person side in terms of developing cross-examination about the limitations of the statistical tool that the state uses in its case to demonstrate the rarity of the match that you're presenting.
Have you received genetic genealogy materials in your presentation?
Yes, so which wasn't surprising to me, because even though typically the government doesn't seek to introduce the forensic genealogy, in its case, it nevertheless is evidence that is a scientific test of material in the case. And so the discovery rules typically call, and for example, in Maryland, in the District of Columbia, call for discovery of scientific testing of evidence in a case, and that's regardless of whether the government is going to introduce it or not. DC is a little different, where it requires either a materiality showing or that the item is introduced into evidence. And so even where there's a limitation on the item being introduced into evidence, that really goes to the item tested, which here is the environmental sample of trace DNA. And of course, the government has twice tested it. And so for the attorney to be able to fulfill their duty to investigate and satisfy the minimum practice standards, they should have access to the scientific testing of that item of evidence, which is central to the case.
Just 1 minute. Thank you. Mr. Risser, I don't have any other questions. I'm going to hang on just a minute for questions.
Thank you.
All right, guys, that was what Court TV deemed as part 1. And that was the direct testimony there of Stephen Mercer talking about IGG. He is a defense attorney. He also co-authored some publications. And he's talking about if you don't have the work, you can't, as a defense attorney, know who to go and hire and seek out as an expert to explain everything about the network in a nutshell. Also, if you don't have that work, then you can't go out and say, "Oh, why did you exclude this person as being the potential, link match?" So without that work, you can't. How do you ask any questions? How do you there's nowhere to begin. You can't defend it. There's nothing you can do. So, and everybody's saying, I'm lost. I'm lost. That's the best. That's the best that I got from it. If that helps. If it doesn't, then I guess we're still lost. So basically, what he just told us in a 45-minute lecture in college, those would be my notes from that. And I'd walk up out of the class and I'd say, "Okay, who can I get to go to that class for me for the next 9 weeks?" And take some notes. But anyways, moving on to part 2. Again, welcome to Truth and Transparency. I appreciate you guys all being here. If you do me a favor and hit the thumbs up or the thumbs down, it is your option. It is your ears. It is your eyes. Your opinion. Does matter. Make yourself known.
An S&P profile can be linked to an STR profile. And that's by zeroing in on sort of the neighboring regions and examining those. So again, I'm not a biologist or scientist, but I'm an attorney, who has a duty to investigate. And to investigate requires hiring experts to.
Whoops, that's not what I wanted. What was that guy? No, not again.
Going to be sitting in the witness box, and you are coming out. So go ahead. Well, first, a couple of things. Number one, I'm going to overrule the objection about her foundation being expert. And then you were given the opportunity to look at PowerPoint. And so where are we?
Your Honor, we began to review the PowerPoint and it was immediately apparent to us that we would need to consult with one of our own experts. There's a lot of scientific terms, charts, graphs, etc. We simply are not prepared with this late notice to respond right now. So what we would ask the court to do, so we don't pull things up today, would be to just give us the same opportunity to reserve cross for a later time, like the other witness who was just disclosed yesterday.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we need to come back again to have informed cross-examination. Go ahead.
All right. Dr. Larkin, I think we are prepared to start with the PowerPoint now. That just means we might have to come back another day and there might be more questions for you. Are you ready?
Yes.
All right. Yes, I can screen share. There we go. Okay. We are participating now. All right. I'm Dr. Lecken. We are going to be talking about genetic genealogy first and how it works. So I'm going to give us the first slide like that and ask you a question.
I think you need to hit play.
If I hit play, then
Show presentation.
clearly we could have had somebody type.
We need another expert.
Hi. Yes, we need another expert. I think we're ready now.
Yes.
Now, are we going to talk about how genetic genealogy works? Think I do it.
Yes.
Tell me what kind of DNA genetic genealogy is.
Okay, so DNA is just DNA, but there are a few different inheritance patterns for DNA. So there is mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome DNA, and then what we call autosomal DNA. And those are the main types that we use.
Would you just have that spelled for the court reporter?
Autosomal, AUTOSOMAL.
What is
All three.
Okay,
Yeah, sorry.
mitochondrial, 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 and then Y chromosome is it's just the letter Y, and then chromosome CHROMOSOME.
Thank you.
What is autosomal DNA?
So autosomal DNA is inherited from both of your parents, all four of your grandparents, all 8 of your great-grandparents, and so on. That's a little bit different from mitochondrial and Y chromosome. Mitochondrial you only get from your mother, so it just tracks that direct maternal line. Y chromosome DNA is only in chromosomal males, and it goes from father to son, so it tracks the direct paternal line. But autosomal DNA can show relationships on all branches of your tree. It's inherited from all of your grandparents and so on.
As a genetic genealogist, do you use one over the other when you do?
I primarily use autosomal DNA. Mitochondrial DNA does not change very rapidly, so it doesn't give you a really good sense of how closely related you might be to someone. Y chromosome DNA is it changes a little bit more rapidly than mitochondrial DNA, but it's still fairly slow. You could have a match to someone and your connection to them could be back in the 1700s. So it's not going to tell you, who your immediate relatives are. Autosomal DNA can give you I call it kind of depth perception. It gives you a much better sense of how far back in time your connection to that other person is. And that's what's primarily used for adoptee searches. It's what's primarily used in the forensic area as well. So that's just showing the inheritance patterns of the DNA.
Does the autosomal DNA, does that provide more matches so that you can do your work easier?
Yes.
How how does this happen? How do you get to do this?
So if you're just a regular old genealogist, you will purchase a DNA kit from one of the main testing companies. They will send you a little tube, and you either spit in the tube, and it seems like a lot of spit, or you do a cheek swab. You put that back in the tube, and you mail it back to the company. The company will then extract the DNA, and
This is why Ann Taylor is wearing a mask, you guys. Okay? She is not giving Moscow, Idaho any of her spit. For Lana's record opinion. Good girl.
do the analysis
Ann.
on it.
As the genetic genealogist, or the person who did the test, what do you get? How do you know when something happens?
Right, when your results are finished, they'll send you an email, and you can then log into the website. And once you do that, you will see all of the companies offer what they call ethnicity estimates, and so it will tell you, whether you're descended from, German stock or Scottish or African or whatever your sort of broader ethnic background is. They will give you a list of matches, which are other people who've taken the same DNA test in the same database and who share DNA with you. So that's the two main things that you get from them.
The same database, what do you mean by that?
So there are multiple companies that offer these services. So the two biggest ones are Ancestry DNA and 23andMe. So for example, if I tested Ancestry and my sister tested 23andMe, we won't get matched to one another because we're not in the same database.
Where you test is specific to where you're going to find who you're related to.
Right.
Okay. All right. You as a genetic genealogist, did cases refer to you?
Yes.
Okay. And so how do you get into these databases?
So at Ancestry DNA, there is a sharing system. So the person who's taken the test can essentially authorize me or invite me to view their DNA results, and then I can do that in my own account. I never have to log into their account. At the other services, with the exception of GenMatch, which we haven't gotten to yet, I would have to log into their accounts to see their DNA matches.
You mentioned that, you're backing up a little bit, but you mentioned that you find out a lot about your ancestry, meaning kind of where you come from. What other kinds of information do you find out?
So, for example, at 23andMe, they offer health reports and trait reports based on your DNA that can tell you if you have a higher than average likelihood of developing certain cancers or certain diseases. They tell you things that are kind of silly, like, do you like cilantro? Or if you're prone to drinking more caffeine than the average or less. But they can tell all of those things from the DNA test that they've done.
And that's only one of the databases that offer that much information.
23andMe does, and then there's a third-party site called Prometheus that you can take your data file and upload it there, and it will run these reports on you. Prometheus, PROMETHEASE. And if I got that wrong, it's not because I'm lying.
You changed slides, and now I have a slide that says microwave. What is that?
So a microwave is the actual piece of lab material that we use to run this test. It was designed, so microwaves were designed for biomedical research. They're designed for scientific research. And unlike the STRs that you use for POTUS, microwaves pretty much scan your entire genome. They're looking at, so we talked about autosomal DNA. They look at about 600,000 individual bits of your autosomal DNA. Those are called single nucleotide polymorphisms. So NUCLEOTIDE and then POLYMORPHISM. I feel like I'm in a stone. These are individual bits of DNA that are known to vary among people. Most of our DNA is identical, so looking at...
She just said, look, I'm in a spelling bee, man. Making her spell all this. Wow. Special.
Those bits are not going to tell you who's related to whom. They look at these
Only in Moscow.
microarrays specifically to target chunks of DNA that we know vary between or among individuals. And so that uses higher levels of DNA than you typically have for forensic purposes.
Doing more like when you talk about spit and fingers swabbing, you have to have a lot of it to do this.
You have to have a fair amount of DNA to do a microarray.
What happens if you don't?
Then there is an alternative. There's an alternative method called whole genome sequencing, and this is there's whole genome sequencing, and the specific way they go about it is called next generation sequencing. And that will actually work on lower levels of DNA. It will work on lower quality DNA, so DNA that might have been broken down because it's been exposed to elements for a while. That will work better on DNA that's contaminated. So it might have bacterial DNA in it, or fungal DNA in it. So that is an alternative approach to microarrays, but it's more labor intensive and it's more expensive.
So you need a microarray or this other way that's more expensive and sounds like more issues there. To get to something that you can put in the computer and find out who you're.
Yes.
What is this?
So this is just kind of a teaching strategy just to show that we have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, have color-coded the grandparent lines to help us track how the matches fit in.
And when you do autosomal DNA, it's this group of people that you're drawing.
Those are people who contributed the DNA in you, yes.
What do we have here?
So this is an outline showing how some of your DNA matches might fit into your tree. So you may have some second cousins or first cousins once removed, or second cousins once removed, who also took the DNA test and are in the same database as you, and they would share DNA with you and would be listed in your matches. And you can see that in this diagram, I'm only showing 2 great-grandparent lines. There are actually 4. The diagram gets too messy if I try to add more. So the thing is, when you get these matches, the DNA company doesn't actually know how you're related to them. It just knows how much DNA you share with them. And so the DNA company is not going to tell you, this is your second cousin. It's just going to say this person shares so much DNA with you, and they might could be your second cousin, but they might be something else. And then it's up to the genealogist to essentially reverse engineer the tree based on the DNA matches.
Do you do that when you have to find out who this person is based on these various matches in different places?
Right.
Do you have experience as a genetic genealogist doing that, where you don't know who this person is, you got to identify this person based on it?
Yes.
So what do you do?
So you will get a list of DNA matches from your testing company, and they are sorted. That list is sorted by how much DNA they share with you. So it's not necessarily sorted by how closely related those people are to you. You get this list, and sometimes they use their real names, the people in the list. Sometimes they use an alias. Depending on the database, you may or may not be able to see their email address. And some of them will have their own family trees linked to their DNA results because they're doing the same thing you are. They're trying to research the family trees. A lot of them won't. And for the people who don't, you have to try to figure out who they are, who their parents are, who their grandparents are, and build trees for them.
Time-consuming process.
It is time-consuming.
You talked about shared DNA. data. It doesn't tell you how closely related some of this.
Right, so we measure autosomal DNA in a unit called centimorgans, CENTIMORGANS. The more centimorgans you share with someone on average, the more closely you are related, but it's possible, for example, there's a range for most of these relationships. So it's actually possible that you could have a full first cousin who shares less DNA with you than a half first cousin. And that's one of the things that complicates the work of a genealogist. We only have an approximate relationship from the centimorgan amount, not a hard and fast, this is definitely so-and-so relationship.
In your work, when you have your unidentified person and you put the profile in and receive matches in various places, you're looking at these centimorgans to try to get a clue. What do you do after you have this information that tells you about centimorgans?
So I have to essentially build trees for these matches. The first step in the process is to figure out how they are related to one another. Before I can figure out, for example, if I'm trying to help an adoptee find their biological parents. To figure out how they are related to their matches, first I have to figure out how the matches are related to one another. And then I kind of reverse engineer where my adoptee will fit into that family tree based on the DNA results. So we mentioned earlier one of the tools that I helped to develop for analyzing DNA results. This is a set of screenshots from this shared centimorgan tool. It's also sometimes called the shared centimorgan project tool. That's too many syllables. So what you do is you will type in the centimorgan amount for one of your matches. On the previous slide, the top match was 72 centimorgans. So if I were working that case, I would type in 72 centimorgans into this tool, and you get the diagram there where the possible relationships are highlighted. So your person of interest is your adoptee. In this tool, will highlight the possible relationships for a 72 centimorgan match. And if you count up all of the little highlighted boxes on there, there are 30 or 35 possible relationships for somebody who shares 72 centimorgans. And so this is sorry, I'm not supposed to talk.
I don't know what the statistic that just popped up is about.
Okay, so I mentioned that this is a statistical tool that's using probabilities, and so even though there are 30 or 35 possible relationships for a 72 centimorgan match, some of them are more likely statistically than others. And so this panel that is in that tool is listing which of the relationships are most likely. And so there are a group of relationships with, I can't quite read that from here, but I think it says half third cousins. That's the most likely group, and then below that, I think it's third cousins. That's the next most likely group, and has the genealogist. That tells me that I'm going to need to build this person's tree back, probably to second great grandparent level, before I can conceivably figure out where my person of interest fits into that tree.
Is that important to know how far back you have to build that tree?
You have to find the connections among the matches, and you sort of need to know where in the tree to look for that.
I think you told us you have to build trees for each of the matches so that you can find those connectors.
Yes, and I have to build out both sides of a matches tree because I don't know if my person of interest is going to be related on their mother's side or on their father's side. I don't know which grandparent it's through. So I essentially have to build the whole tree back several generations to find the connections.
Are these decisions that you as the genetic genealogist have to make to do your work finding that?
So if I was a student in her class, I would say to her, so basically what you're saying is that this is a process. This is not something that you can just come to and get such like a quick answer. You type in www. blah, blah, and then boom, you're going to have your answer because this is just something that happens so quickly. this is a process and you're breaking down that process and that it does take time, right? I think the thing that Mr. Willis said, these things take time, folks. You know, these things take time. We have to take it to the lab. These things take time.
Yes, but I have to continue to build trees things.
Now, do you have to build trees for all of those 35 matches? Or do you do it until you kind of figure out these are the quantity?
There are some matches that I may not be able to build trees for. Maybe I can't figure out who they are. So on this slide, there's only 5 matches shown, and so only 2 of the people of that 5 have posted their own trees. That little icon that I'm pointing the arrows at show that those 2 matches have built their own trees. And so that saves me a lot of work because I can look at their tree and rather than having to build it from scratch, I can, they've listed their parents and their grandparents and I can just go ahead and double check to make sure that they put the right people down rather than having to build the trees from scratch. The other people, I either have to build their trees from scratch if I can figure out who they are, or sometimes I need to have to skip them if they have a really common name and I don't know where they live or what their age is. I may, if it's John Smith, I may never be able to figure out who they are and build out a tree for them because there are thousands of John Smiths.
I think this graphic shows us the process and how far you have to build trees for the matches. Try to identify the one person. Do I understand that right?
Yes, this is just a simple example where I've built out 2 hypothetical trees for 2 hypothetical matches. In which case, in this examples, I've gone out to the first great grandparents.
What are you looking for?
I'm looking for connections between match. So match 1 is on the left, match 2 is on the right. I'm looking for commonalities between their 2 trees. I want to see how match 1 and match 2 are related to one another. And so in this case, I've identified, and this is hypothetical, of course, that John Smith and Mary Jones married and had children, and they were the great grandparents of the person on the left tree. And John Smith and Mary Jones were also the great grandparents of the match on the right. So now I know that match 1 and match 2 are second cousins to one another. That's kind of the first hook that I have into trying to figure out how my person of interest fits into that tree. And so I would then diagram.
What do you do from there?
Yes, thank you, sorry. I would then start building what I call a descendant diagram, and I will do this in a sketching software. So I have John Smith and Mary Jones, and I've listed their 2 children and their grandchildren. Then I put the DNA matches in there so I can see how the matches are related to one another.
Let me see if I understand this. Matches to your unknown person and then build their tree out and found great grandparents or the same great grandparents in both these other matches to be unknown. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And then you took that match and started figuring out who their kids were, and then you their kids had kids. Is that what we're seeing here?
Right, and so what I'm looking for now, so I found these 2, match 1 and match 2, who are second cousins to one another. What I'm looking for now are ways to integrate more DNA matches into that tree that I've just got my hook on.
Why do you want to do that?
Because the more DNA matches I have, the stronger my statistical analysis for where my person of interest fits into that tree.
How do you?
So if I'm working an adoptee case, my goal is to get my adoptee into as many databases as possible. I always call it tested ancestry because that's the biggest database. Then 23andMe because it's the second biggest. And then my heritage is the next in size. And so I want to get them into all of these databases because I can do this. I can build this tree using some matches from Ancestry and some matches from 23 and some from my heritage. And again, I'm doing this so that I have as much statistical data as possible when I try to place my person of interest into that tree.
That's when you have somebody who's doing their own DNA testing and then sharing their profile with you, so you can filter three out, try to identify who your biological is. I think I got, we'll go to the next slide. It looks like you replaced the people, the matches, with numbers. What's going on here?
Those may be hard to see, but in this case, I'm showing an example listing the central organ amounts to the various DNA matches that I've managed to place into this tree.
In this one, you have a whole new red line you didn't have before. How did you figure it out?
So this is a hypothesis. It's an educated guess about where my person of interest might fit into that tree based on how much DNA they share with those 5 matches that I could document. And it might be right, it might be wrong. It's just an educated guess. It's a way to guide my next step in the research. My next step in the research at this point might need to dig into another database and see if I can find more matches. I would run the what are the odds analysis tool to see what other hypotheses might fit.
You want to tell me about the what are the odds tool now?
Sure, I can. That's a different slide. So this is the what are the odds tool. You basically build the descendant diagram that was on the previous slide, but into this tool. You enter the centimorgan amounts, so that's the measure of shared DNA. You enter the centimorgan amounts into the WATO tool. Sorry, we call it WATO for short, WATO. So you enter the centimorgan amounts where those individual DNA matches fit into the tree, and then you can ask the tool to suggest possible hypotheses for you. And that's what those teal boxes are. Those teal boxes are places where the tool is saying your person of interest could fit into this tree in this spot based on the DNA matches.
This tool tells you kind of where to look.
Yes.
In that form. What do you do from there?
So from here, there are several hypotheses there. You could go back to the previous slide. Thank you. There are several hypotheses there. So what I want to do, and each one of them is going to have a score. And so what I want to do is focus on the hypotheses that have the highest scores, because those are the ones that are most likely. And I might investigate whether I'm looking for a birth father, was he in the right place at the time of conception, or was he serving overseas? If he was serving overseas, then I rule him out. I might reach out to members of his family and ask them to do a DNA test for me, because then I can add their DNA match to this analysis and sort of slowly over time focus in on my most likely candidate, for example, if it's birth father.
Does that mean you reach out to the regular people that haven't chosen to do this and see if they volunteer?
The reason that we're not hearing anything from the prosecution is because at the end of all of this, they have one thing to say, which is, this is a big fucking waste of time because we're not using any IgG. So what's going on here? We're not using that. That's not like, we're not even talking about IgG. We're not using it. We don't plan on using it. We received a tip from the FBI that said Bryan Kohberger and to investigate him. So we just started to investigate Bryan Kohberger. That's why they're just sitting there and not doing anything, in my opinion. I could be wrong.
Do you want to put the DNA in to help build the family tree?
Yes, at times I will do that.
I think we're ready for this slide. Yeah.
Okay, so it's the same tree, but I'm showing a different scenario in which the DNA matches were lower. They shared less DNA. This is just another hypothetical example to show how the probabilities and the suggested hypotheses will change depending on how much DNA those matches share with you in the first place.
That makes it work more complicated.
It does. The lower the DNA matches, the harder it is to actually find what you're looking for.
Is strategic testing, and you've been talking about here, is that what you mean when you say something you have to ask people to test?
Yes, some genealogists call it target testing, some call it strategic testing. You're essentially reaching out to people who haven't tested yet and ask them, hey, I want to do a genealogy test for me. And you're doing that to help narrow down the connections.
This one has some arrows pointing in the direction. What's going on?
Right, I'm afraid you can't see the scores on that tree because it's kind of small. But those arrows are pointing at the hypotheses in this tree that have the highest scores. So that's where I would try to target relatives who might be willing to do a DNA test for me.
And those scores come from the tool.
Those come from the tool and they're
And those give you, I guess, information.
I like this lady. She's funny. She's got a sense of humor.
yeah, the probabilities are based on the shared Morgan amounts.
We're going to shift and talk about forensic genetic genealogy. Tell us what you mean by that.
So forensic is basically pertinent to any sort of legal proceeding or court case, not a lawyer. So I got that wrong. But in this case, sometimes so the Department of Justice calls this work forensic genetic genealogy. A lot of practitioners call it investigative genetic genealogy, but it's the same thing.
Does that mean it's work that's done for law enforcement?
It's work that's done for law enforcement, and it's also done, oftentimes I think the client might actually be a medical examiner if you're dealing with an unknown human remains.
Do you do that kind of work?
I do not.
Are you going to talk about that?
I have learned a bit about it, yes.
How will you learn it?
I've learned about it by communicating with practitioners who do it, and also by attending conferences and watching recorded videos.
Did you do it if you wanted to?
Yes.
There's no other qualifications you need other than what you have right
No, not at the moment.
now. The slide talks about the price and quality of DNA. What kind of DNA is needed for forensic DNA? What kind of use?
So you can use any type of DNA the same as you would use for regular genealogy. You could do mitochondrial, you could do Y chromosome, you could do autosomal, and as I mentioned before,
Spell that again,
most of
please.
this work is using autosomal DNA. And the difference is that if somebody's spitting in a tube, they're providing a lot of DNA, and they're providing clean DNA, and they're providing DNA that gets preserved with the fluid to keep it from breaking down. And that's not always the situation that you're going to find at either crime scenes or if you're dealing with unknown human remains.
I know we talked about the microarray a while, and if there was another way to get this profile to your work. Is that where we're going?
That's where we're going.
Tell me about that.
Okay, so next generation genome sequencing is a technique that you can use to analyze the entire human genome. You're not just focusing on the 600 or 700,000 bits that the genealogy company uses. You're trying to sequence the whole thing. And that can sometimes work when there's not enough DNA for a microarray.
How is that done?
It's hard to explain. So I'm using this graphic to try to explain it. So imagine that the solid red line at the top is the entire genome that we're trying to analyze. Next genome sequencing actually focuses on little subsets, and it's kind of like skimming a document. So if you skim a document, you're not reading every single word. Next generation sequencing is not trying to read every single little bit of DNA along the way. Instead, it's skimming little bits, and it's missing a lot on the first skim. And then it skims it again, and it will miss some on the second skim, but it might pick up bits it didn't pick up the first time. And so it keeps skimming the DNA, and after the analysis is done, you can kind of reconstruct from the little snippets that you skimmed along the way, and you can post the next gap. So these are the portions in gray that were skimmed in the multiple episodes, and those are called reads in the next generation sequencing process. The more reads you do, the more of the genome you can reconstruct, and the more confident you can be that you did it correctly. Because sometimes if you're skimming a word, you might, the word might be there and you read there if you're reading too fast, right? So the more times you skim an individual piece of DNA, the more confident you can be that it was called accurately.
Is there a number of times that's best practice skim?
So for medical research, for biomedical research, the companies who sell this equipment recommend that you do 30 times. They call it a 30 times coverage to get a confident read. Oftentimes in forensic work, they're not able to get 30x reads, and so they're working with fewer skimming. And that skimming is not a technical term. I'm just using the analogy to teach this.
Talk about missing information when you skim. This slide says that it's filled in by a word called indication. Is that what this slide means?
So if you can't do 30x coverage of the genome, which is often the case when you're working with low quantities of DNA or contaminated DNA, you won't get the whole genome. You'll be missing pieces. This is a stage of the process called bioinformatics, and you actually have a specialist who goes in and uses statistical methods to try to fill in the pieces that were missing in the initial analysis.
Does that mean that person's projecting what would be there? Is that showing us that?
That's showing us the parts that were imputed. That's the term that we would use.
All right, once you have this information after bioinformatics has added their details, then what happens?
So recall that the next generation sequencing is analyzing the entire genome. But the genealogy companies, the matching databases, are not interested in the entire genome. They're not going to analyze the whole genome. They only want the SNPs, so the SNPs, that were analyzed by the microarray. So now the bioinformatician has to go in, essentially delete a whole bunch of the whole genome data so that they're only left with the portions that would have been on a microarray had they done microarray in the first place.
This happens after they're filled in to make a whole, they're stripped back to make it usable.
Yes.
Like genetic genealogy database. How do you know if you're not just left with all of those filled in?
I'm sorry, I don't quite understand the question.
So when these are stripped back out so that they're usable, so they become an SNP, it's usable. This is after the imputation.
Right.
How do you know what is left?
How do you know which parts were imputed and which parts were from the next generation sequencing?
Yeah.
The bioinformatician would have access to that data, but as a genealogist, you wouldn't know.
Okay. That question would be for somebody different.
That would be for someone.
After the SNP is created, then
So then you have a file that would look just like what you could get from one of the actual genealogy testing companies, and you can upload that if it's a forensic kit for forensic purposes. You can upload that to two main databases. One of them is called Family Tree DNA, which in the trade we generally just call DNA, and the other one is GenMatch. And there are a couple of smaller databases, but they're pretty tiny.
Enjoy Ancestry.
Ancestry will not let you upload a file into the database, nor will OneDream.
They have to
There's
do
no
their own
process to do it. The only way to get into those two databases is by spending it.
All right, on this slide, does this represent most of these companies that do the genetic analysis?
Those are all of the main companies. There are a few smaller ones, but they're really quite tiny, and often for those we don't even have decent estimates of how large they are.
By large, do you mean the number of people that have uploaded a profile or spin a few the ones created?
Yes.
There. And I think you let us know that law enforcement uses and can only use GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA.
Per the terms of service of the companies, they are only allowed to use Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch, and there are two smaller dedicated databases. One of them is called DNA Justice, which has, as of yesterday, about 500 people in it. And the other one is DNA Solved, which is owned by Optum, and I have no idea how many people in it.
Those two that you just talked about, can anybody use those, or are those only law enforcement?
DNA Solves and Courtroom.
Yes.
Yes, those are only for law enforcement. A regular genealogist wouldn't have access to any output from those. You can voluntarily contribute your DNA, but then you can't use it for your own genealogy.
And GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, are those law enforcement only, or are those usable by others?
Those are usable by regular genealogists. Both of them existed long before the field of forensic genealogy did.
They also allow.
They both allow law enforcement to upload the kits, the DNA kits, into the databases.
My heritage, I don't think we've talked a ton about that. I understand Ancestry and 23, we have to do your own sample, they do their own thing. But my heritage, how do you have to do this fitness proof for that?
No, so MyHeritage sells DNA tests, as does Family Tree DNA. So you can send a kit in. Those are cheek swabs; they're not stick. That's technical. But for both MyHeritage and Family Tree DNA, you could test directly with them, but you could also take your data file from one of the other companies and just upload the file. And it's just a text file that has thousands and thousands of lines of DNA data.
So as a genetic genealogist, you are working with somebody and you can take their profile and make it 23andMe and put it in MyHeritage and Family Tree DNA.
Yes.
You also put it in GEDmatch.
Yes.
And law enforcement can only search Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch. Can they search your person?
If there's a DNA match to my person, they will see that match.
Okay. Does your person have to agree, law enforcement, to let that happen?
If we're talking about my adoptee, so it's complicated because the rules have changed continually over the past few years. As it currently stands at GEDmatch, if we were to take a brand new kit, a brand new adoptee client, and upload their data to GEDmatch, we would have to consent. The client would have to either consent or decline to consent to participate in law enforcement matching.
If they decline to participate and law enforcement searches GEDmatch, then they should not see your clients.
They should not see my clients. Okay.
Same with Family Tree DNA.
Family Tree DNA, the system is kind of the inverse. If you add a kit to Family Tree DNA, they automatically opt you in. There is a way to opt yourself out, but you kind of have to know where to find it. It's not obvious.
Again, a person can keep their information private, so it doesn't wind up in law enforcement searches.
They yes.
Family Tree DNA. And MyHeritage is different, law enforcement shouldn't upload.
MyHeritage explicitly prohibits it.
Boom.
Did I just ask you all the questions that related to the arrows?
No, so the database, the total database at Family Tree DNA and the total database at GenMatch are both larger than the number of people who opted in. So not everyone at Family Tree DNA has opted into law enforcement matching. Not everyone at GenMatch has opted into law enforcement matching. And so the arrows are the gray bars are showing my estimates, and these are my personal estimates for the number of people in each of those databases who are officially accessible to law enforcement for matching.
And that's because those companies have
Thank you.
the two categories of
Yes.
I think we're now to the last section where we're going to talk about the work products of genetic genealogy.
Here we go.
What is that topic?
So these are the, if I have an adopted client, this is what I would give the client at the end of our agreement. These are the products that I would give them, and in basically everybody doing forensic genetic genealogy that I know of, except possibly the FBI, originally trained as a genetic genealogist. So this is what we are all used to giving to our clients.
What are we seeing?
She just said, except for the FBI, there's your big, like, FBI, I don't know what they do, but I know everything else and everything else. But FBI, she snuck that in there. I think that's important. So hopefully you guys heard that.
On this first slide that you did here.
Okay, so those are two of the match lists. The one on the left is what a typical match list looks like at GenMatch. The one on the right is what a typical match list looks like at Family Tree DNA. For my clients, I will actually screenshot the matches and put that in the appendix to my report. I also copy all of the matches into another program because sometimes people will, they'll be in the match list of my adoptee, and then they'll disappear. And so I like to have a record that, hey, when I uploaded this kit, I had these matches there. So even if they decide to delete their kit later, I still have a record that they shared so and so much DNA with my client.
This is like a family tree.
It does look like a family tree. And it's anonymized. There are no real.
Dr. Larkin, what are we seeing on this family tree?
So this is the family tree that I would have built for my client. And this would have attached to it documentation, so birth and death records. It would have census records if I was able to find the family, the census, immigration records, any sort of documentation that I might find. I often will link obituaries if I find them, if I find family photos. A lot of times you might find articles in the newspaper, and I will link everything that I find to this family tree that I then give the client.
Does that help verify to your client that the results you gave them were accurate?
Yes, it helps verify that all of the relationships that I'm reporting to them are documented and
And it looks like you give them a copy of the descendant diagram.
I did.
And you give them a copy of what are the odds. And the written report.
I did. If the client requests it, I will write a report.
Other than those things that you give your clients, what would be available on the forensic side of genetic genealogy?
Right, so they should have the original DNA data file, whether it was microarray or the next generation sequencing. I don't need to give that to my client because they had that with them. There are some complications when you're dealing with forensic DNA because I didn't have a person spit a whole bunch of DNA into a tube. Sometimes you might have a mixture where more than one person is represented in the sample. So that needs to be analyzed, and there presumably would be documentation associated with that analysis, which is called deconvolution. C-O-N-V-O-L-U-T-I-O-N. If there was not, if there was non-human DNA mixed, contamination mixed in with the sample, sometimes, and not always, sometimes they will do what is called enrichment, where they're trying to increase the proportion of DNA that is human in that sample. If that process was done at the lab, there should be a record of it. The bioinformatics that we talked about, so imputing any missing data and then stripping out all of the non-genealogical DNA points, all of those there should be records of.
Oh, I think you have logins or kit numbers.
Right. So when you have once you've gone through all these steps, you've done what we call the wet lab work, where you're actually working with the samples, and then you've done the computer analyses, you end up with the output file that mimics. It's like a fake microarray file, right? So it mimics the data that we would have gotten from a genealogy company. GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA both charge law enforcement to use their database, and so there should be some sort of contractual agreement or receipts that you paid the company for the upload. And then there are logins, because for you to be able to see the matches, you have to log into that account. You have to have access. At Family Tree DNA, you have to log into that specific account. At GEDmatch, I believe you can give access to a few different researchers, but they have to know what's called a kit number, which is the unique identifying number for that.
When you said a fake microarray, it reminded me that when we talked about microarrays, you told us that those contain a ton of personal memory.
Yes.
This also has all that?
Yes.
Basically, what you just said there in a nutshell, ladies and gentlemen, is that there are what I like to call receipts. Where are the receipts? All right. You law enforcement, okay, great. You still got to pay. So there's going to be receipts. There's going to be, if you log in, you can't just do this untraceable. This is traceable. There's going to be receipts. You have to pay for this. And that's huge, in my opinion. Just give us a damn receipt that you even paid for the damn shit, okay? Everybody knows here at Truth and Transparency, I am all about receipts, or you can take your happy ass right on out of here. Prove it or it didn't happen type of thing. But where are the receipts?
And because there's so many more, I guess, people or kids or profiles in Nigeria, is that a place that somebody that can find a match might want to know?
Yes.
Dr. Larkin, thank you. I don't have any other questions, but don't leave quite yet. I'll pass it to you.
Thank you. Any cross-examination? Okay, thank you. All right, may this witness be excused?
Yes.
Okay, so if you're excused, you can stay here if you like, or you can get on with your life. Thank you. Very educational.
Very educational. All right. Lots to talk about. What I'm going to have you guys do is I'm going to have you guys use the comment section of this video to talk about those first two witnesses, and parts 3 and 4 will be in your final episode when it has to do with this hearing. But use the comment section of this video to let me know what you think. We can communicate about that, and then there will be a live discussion to talk about the hearing in general and point out in a quick recap of what each person said, and then what the prosecution had to say about it, and then what decisions Judge has to make about what he heard yesterday. So, yeah, that's going to be a wrap here at Truth and Transparency for the hearing that took place on August 18th. Again, I want to say thank you to all the mods for modding, as always. Everybody that purchased a membership for somebody else, thank you. Everybody that super chatted, super stickers, thank you. Bought yourself your own membership, thank you. Truth and Transparency, appreciate you guys. If you guys did not know, Jared Brannigan's ex-wife was just arrested for conspiring to commit the murder of Jared. She is located in Washington. They just had her in the courtroom. She's going to be fighting that extradition over to Florida. So she's not on bond. So it will be interesting here. But things are starting to move forward with that case so that Jared's widow and his kids can have some closure there. So there will be I see a pending case coming soon out of Florida. The guy that was the shooter, he pled guilty to second-degree murder, and I'm sure he is going to be testifying in that, trial that we will see of Gardner and her estranged husband that was arrested. I think it's been almost like a year since he's been arrested, or at least a half of a year. But again, as always, thank you guys. We'll see you soon. And I did a Karen Reed episode last night. TNT here, myself and Bella got to get in contact with Alan Jackson, and we're definitely Team Karen Reed and Team Jackson. So we will be in Moscow for that trial. We'll be right on the outskirts of Boston for stuff that's coming up with Karen Reed. And Boots will be definitely on the ground traveling here. I usually do a lot of my traveling in the fall and winter. So summertime is for the family time. Again, guys, thank you so much. Have a great one.
Nobody from the universe. Shock value. And so what he did was he had taken pictures California.
Oh, you're from I would be outraged if I live in Moscow right now. I'd be lighting some cars on fire out there. I'd be flipping some cars. I'd get the frats going wild. Let's get some noise complaints going.